Welcome again to the second part of our study in the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 8 as we continue with this online devotional series entitled Moments with Mike. I just want to start today by asking you a very simple question. Do you remember as a child, or do you remember as a parent, or do you remember some time in your life when either you or someone near to you said, "Life is just not fair"? Do you remember that? Well, in verses 10 through 14 of Ecclesiastes chapter 8, Solomon deals with what he would call the inequities of life. The inequities of life. That things just aren't fair at times. We see that as great as our judicial system is, we see story after story now as DNA testing has become so much more advanced that people who have spent decades languishing in prison for crimes that they did not commit are suddenly exonerated because there's new evidence and there's new research and science that proves them to have been innocent. But the reality is that sometimes life is not fair. And so in this 5 verses within chapter 8, let's deal with 3 inequities in life and see what we can make of them. In verse 10, the first one is this: that unrighteous people are eulogized with praise upon their death. Unrighteous men are eulogized or spoken well of with praise upon their death. We would like to think that the truth about people would be pronounced, but we all know too well that people who have not lived lives that are worthy of great esteem, great imitation, and great praise are often glowingly spoken of in their death. And it seems like everything that they've done, which should have been, if you will, castigated and should have been rebuked and should have been, if you will, spoken to, seems to have been forgotten. As someone who has done literally hundreds of memorial services over the course of my more than 4 decades in pastoral ministry, I can tell you that one of the most challenging things I'm asked to do sometimes is to do a memorial service for someone that I did not know. And it becomes incumbent upon me to find out as much about their life as I can. But Solomon says here in verse 10 that he just does not understand how someone who could live a life that was so unjust and unfair and unrighteous would be spoken of so highly in their death. The second one is in verse 11. Unrighteous men continuing their unjust actions in light of no immediate judgment coming upon them. I do love this passage. I'm going to read it to you from the New American Standard. It says this in verse 11. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to do evil. Wow. Because the sentence against a committed act that was criminal in nature was delinquent in coming or failed to be exercised, what does that do to the heart of one who is given over to do evil? Simply to become more hardened and to commit more evil. Juries make mistakes, to be sure, because juries are made up of people whose judgment sometimes is extremely fallible. Robert Frost, in one of his writings, once said that a jury consisted of 12 people chosen to decide who had the better lawyer. Unfortunately, there are times when people get off, if you will, scot-free. Let's remind ourselves in those times that there is an ultimate reckoning day. Both Romans 14 and Corinthians 5 talk about the judgment seat in which the actions of men will be judged by God. But here in verse 11, another inequity of life is people brought into a judge-jury situation and not found to be guilty are just emboldened to do more and more acts of evil and violence. And then finally, in verse 14, unrighteous men seemingly prospering while the righteous man fails to receive the reward of a good life. We see that happening all the time, don't we? People like you and I who work hard and struggle. And although I can say to you that I've never missed a meal that I can recall, and I've lived a fairly charmed life, certainly not because I haven't had issues come into my life that tested me and tried me and challenged me. But here in verse 14, once again, Solomon says, the wicked man seems to prosper. Psalm 37, Psalm 73. While the righteous man just ekes out a bare existence. Another inequity of life. Life is full of those. That's why it's important for us to remember these two truths from verses 12 and 13. The wicked will eventually be judged and the righteous rewarded. There is payday coming. I think about that. Next couple of weeks, I'm going to my tax accountant meeting. And my tax guy has a way of letting Cindy and I know whether or not we're going to have to pay the government or we're going to get a reward from them. He gives us a payday bar. So when I go on my tax appointment, I'm hoping at the end of my hour with my tax man that he reaches across the table and gives me a payday candy bar, or maybe a couple because Cindy's always with me. Here's the deal. The righteous will be rewarded and the wicked will be judged, just not necessarily in this lifetime. That's a truth to treasure. And finally, we are called to encourage the legislation of proper laws and the enforcement of those laws by capable people. If we don't have, if you will, law enforcement in its various forms, we will have anarchy. We will have chaos. We will have rioting in the streets. We will have the destruction of both public and private property. We have a responsibility to enact and to empower legislation that protects those rights that God has given to us in the great Constitution of this country. I recall that my father told my brother and I many times growing up that the definition of a bad law is one that is not enforced. There may be a few of those on the books, to be sure. But as men and women who are called to be both citizens of the state and citizens of the kingdom of heaven, we need to continue to speak truth to power. We need to have the freedom to resist when we are asked to do something or are told we cannot do something that the scripture enjoins upon us. But we also have a responsibility to continue to act as the voice of truth and reason, often for those who have no voice of their own. We'll see you again soon as we jump into Ecclesiastes chapter 9 in our next Moments with Mike.